Ladies and gentlemen, in the most abbreviated and condensed form, why conduct dynamic modeling for health and healthcare? Well, the fundamental motivation is we're struggling as a society with ever more complex and daunting health policy challenges. But these challenges are not merely complicated. They are complex in a technical sense. We're dealing with systems which have many tangled components, where interventions in one piece of the system ripple through to interventions into effects throughout the system. Whether we look at ED weights, opioids, or antimicrobial resistance, we're struck with the fact that we're dealing often with systems that cannot be reduced to simply their pieces. Where to understand the system, we have to go beyond an understanding of the individual pieces, as important as that is, and understand the system as a whole. Otherwise, we're operating like blind men and the elephant. The challenges here manifest very strongly in two areas. Number one, we need to understand what's going on. Does the evidence support my hypothesis? Where's the situation likely to go next? Here, we often run into profound challenges because when we have theories that are articulated only in our heads, they're somewhat inchoate. They're not refined by others, and trying to understand their implied dynamics in our head is profoundly difficult. We're just not very good at that in terms of our biologic complement. As a result, it's very hard to test, does the evidence support my hypothesis, because we can't see what behavior exactly should be resulting from my hypothesis. We can't test that to see if it's consistent with empirical observations. Secondly, we need to understand where to best intervene in the system, how to intervene, how soon we should have effect. When we're dealing with a situation of the sort we've been talking about, it's very difficult to understand where to invest resources for action. Here we may have a somewhat inchoate theory in our head, and trying to combine it with possible interventions or policy portfolios to understand which of them will yield the desired outcomes is profoundly difficult. If we can't even go from a theory in the world to a precisely implied dynamics, how can we possibly arrive at some understanding of which interventions will yield the desired outcome with this very imprecise theory? So the consequences of these challenges are profound. They include misperceptions about a system, policy resistance, situations where the system blows back against us. They include difficulty in learning from experience, planning and deciding about the system, coordinating and designing a system effectively. So, ladies and gentlemen, we often end up in systems which terribly underperform. Even well stocked with resources, we find ourselves going in circles because the resources are not coordinated well, because we're putting our efforts and our money and resources into the wrong things. Into this sphere comes simulation modeling. Simulation modeling can be viewed as a type of way of capturing in an operational form dynamic hypotheses about the causal structure of a system. Causal because we want to look at counterfactuals, how things would change if we put into place certain types of interventions or policy portfolios that have never been examined within our particular context before. Now, simulation models have many uses, but I want to talk about some of the most basic of them. One of the sets of reasons that I engage in modeling is to learn more effectively, learn more quickly, learn more deeply from the evidence and from the understanding of others. One of the reasons we can do this with models is because by creating models, we make our assumptions shared and explicit. We put them in a form that others can understand, critique, and refine, and thereby advance our collective understanding. Whether it's captured in semi-quantitative models or in fully quantitative models, where we'll use mechanisms such as state charts, stocks and flows, etc., we can arrive at a situation where we leverage the understanding from large groups of people in order to refine the model. Secondly, we can make, by putting our assumptions into this sort of form, we can make them precise and testable. And here we look beyond models as any sort of crystal ball, but rather as learning tools. By allowing us to precisely say, with these sets of precisely specified assumptions, we should see this behavior, we can test the degree to which our assumptions are consistent with empirical evidence. We can test the degree to which they are indeed consistent with current understanding of system practitioners, thereby allowing us to put the empirical evidence to use that would have been impossible if we had relied on models and understanding in our head. In short, models here allow us to think more deeply, more consistently, more quickly through the consequences of our actions. we can test the consistency of our assumptions against a wide variety of possible behaviors. And here, ladies and gentlemen, if we have this mismatch between what the model expects on the one hand and what we see in terms of the evidence, it's not a failure of the model. It's best viewed as a failure, as a success of modeling, in the sense that we've identified an inconsistency, a previously latent, unspotted inconsistency between our assumptions as captured within our model, between our thinking, in short, and the evidence that's at hand. We wouldn't have found that often without a model to point out this inconsistency, to allow us to map from our assumptions to what's implied behavior and allow us to cross-check it against the empirical evidence. So this supports theorizing about what's going on out there. And as Francis Bacon long said, truth will sooner come out of error than from confusion. Put a stake in the ground, posit something, test the degree to which it's consistent, learn from it, and improve your thinking. In short, fail early, fail often, and ladies and gentlemen, fail forward. And that's what's enabled by models. Why else do I model? I model because we all use mental models, and by using, but here we can use computational models that consciously challenge and sharpen those mental models. We take our mental models that everyone is using and put them out there in the clear light of day and test them against empirical evidence. We use tools to improve our mental models that we all rely on, so that we can behave more judiciously with respect to the world. Here we're building models that capture our understanding of the situation, using them to tell us the logical consequences of that, which we'd never arrive at our head, and using that to refine the mental model, and then using the expectations from this to observe things further from the world, to further sharpen our mental model, to test what the model's predictions are against the world, to undertake interventions, compare them against what our model, and by extension our mental model, expects, and use it to refine our simulation model and the mental model that lies behind it. In short, we use models to learn more quickly, more deeply, and more thoroughly about a system. Something that's especially important when we have a paucity of empirical evidence. So we have to put a premium on learning quickly from what evidence we do have. I also model, as it might be obvious now, to understand what's going on, to test, okay, is this theory consistent with the available evidence across all different areas? This is particularly powerful when combined with machine learning algorithms in the form of particle filtering and particle MCMC. Here we go beyond traditional modeling, we can give, as it were, a three-dimensional picture of the system that results. Much like in a CAT scan, we take images from many different directions, each of whose images is highly incomplete, occluded, for example, very limited in its field of view, but we knit those together into a 3D view of the patient. So it is with machine learning and these sort of models. We can take diverse areas of evidence together with model structure to give us a picture, probabilistic, about what's likely going on in areas of the system we cannot directly measure, because the evidence that we do have together with the model structure tells us what is likely going on in those areas of the system where we don't have direct evidence. It can point us to what's likely happening there. Now, once we secure conviction in a model, once it's tested against the empirical evidence, against the crucible of our empirical evidence and the understanding of people in the system, we can use it to estimate intervention effects. We can go beyond the crude steps we can take with informal reasoning in this area, and instead use a model to combine a rigorous, precisely specified, explicit theory about what's going on in the world with an understanding of possible interventions to arrive at understanding of what each portfolio of interventions would yield. And we can test the degree to which that's consistent with our desired outcomes, and then iterate further in different interventions which bring us closer and closer to desired outcomes. I also model to anticipate what's coming, particularly powerful in the context of machine learning, where we can probabilistic with particle filtering, particle MCMC, probabilistic expectations about what's likely to come out. Here, these mechanisms have built in all the evidence to these points, to this point, as illustrated in the red dots, and we look forward and we see some regularities that we're very likely going to see decreasing cases for the next year or so, and then an upsurge after that. Or we're going to see here an upsurge almost immediately. That can allow us to anticipate what's coming and marshal resources. And finally, I model because it's the least bad of the alternatives. Like Winston Churchill said about all forms of government, about democracy, it's the worst of all forms of government except for everything else. So it is with dynamic models. It's the worst of all ways to learn, to work, to plan, to move forward, except for everything else that I'm aware of. Thanks so much, ladies and gentlemen, for this very abbreviated